Distinguished Excellencies, senior academics, captains of industry, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. This afternoon, we are looking at an issue that is dear to our hearts and that has assembled us in this hall. So let me start briefly by introducing our speakers. First to take the floor will be Her Excellency and Professor. Excellency and Professor, to my right.
I'm promoted.
Yes, you know, because she's been so much part of the diplomatic service that we have benefited so much from her input, just as we are going to do today. Professor Susie Graham is an associate professor of international relations in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. She previously served as the head of Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. And to support her ably is Mr. Zahar Lahar, the Chief Director in the Department of United Nations Peacekeeping Division in South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation. In his more than 2 decades of diplomatic practice, he has served at the UN Permanent Mission, at the South African Office in the Permanent Mission of Africa to the UN in New York. Ladies and gentlemen, I will now invite our first speaker, Professor and Excellency. So that stands. Please, you have the floor. Let me say that for the purpose of modesty, we're going to take on the 2 speakers for 20 minutes each. And at the prerogative of the chair that I occupy here, plus or minus 5 minutes will be appreciated. Not more than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to rely on you wholeheartedly for that warning. So good afternoon, colleagues. I'm going to be looking at South Africa at the United Nations Security Council, reflecting on Ubuntu diplomacy from a more theoretical angle, and then we'll move on to my partner in crime on the panel, who will look at it from a more practitioners-based perspective. So in its current strategic plan, 2020-2025, DIRCO outlines South Africa's government as having actively contributed to the maintenance of international peace and security through involvement in mediation and conflict resolution efforts, as well as the deployment of peacekeepers to peacekeeping missions of the UN, and served on the United Nations Security Council. This statement sums up the Republic's view of its actions since being welcomed back as a fully participating member of the United Nations General Assembly in June 1994, and brought with it a little bit of Madiba magic, which is how we refer to Madiba in our country. Without a doubt, South Africa has always been keen to serve as an African non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, having done so now 3 times in record timing, in 2007-8, 2011-12, and 2019-2020. As a case study, South Africa has, since 1994, proclaimed itself as an advocate of multilateral diplomacy and as a representative of Africa in multilateral platforms. We also know that South Africa has been repeatedly criticized by various observers at home and abroad for some of its decisions in its voting behavior, the area of interest I'm particularly focused on, in terms of its Security Council terms. We also know that since 2004, South Africa really has been recorded by most theorists as trying its very best in terms of diplomatic efforts to represent as a voice of reason in world affairs, a phrase that is often used. And that South African foreign policymakers remain convinced that the multilateral system of global governance is the best hope for the challenges that face humanity. The important thing is that obviously people must know where we stand as South Africa in our track record, and there must be a systematic way in which we engage in our foreign policy matters. Earlier this year, US Ambassador to South Africa really reflected on South Africa's decision to abstain from some important decisions at the UN in relation to Ukraine as quite disappointing and unfortunate, and very importantly, called for a return to diplomacy based on Ubuntu. Now, Ubuntu, for those who are not aware, is an African philosophical worldview and gained prominence in South Africa really since 1994 and emphasizes common humanity and interdependence. South Africa's white paper on foreign policy in 2011 also reflected on this, building a better world, diplomacy of Ubuntu, and focused on South Africa's humanist foreign policy. It really means a person is a person through others, that there is a common humanity, and this is the important statement I'm trying to emphasize here, a continued quest for consensus aimed to establish harmony within society. So I just want to quickly remind us of some other famous faces in the UN Security Council platform and reflect on what is South Africa's foreign policy, how people may have started to doubt whether or not we had a consistent or coherent one in 2007 when we started to make our votes on human rights related issues. And then we have 2011, 2012, and whether or not South Africa had an ambiguous foreign policy, or was it simply a misunderstood foreign policy? And the fact was, perhaps it just needed to be more clearly communicated to the public so we would understand it better. And so what we have was the introduction of Ubuntu magazine by Durko. And this would help settle for the public in terms of a really important, I think, public diplomacy campaign, the reasons behind or explanations for votes at the UN. And I think an absolutely essential move by Durko in this respect, so that South African citizens, or at least those who are interested in what the South African country does abroad, would know why. And the focus is obviously very much on communicating with and educating stakeholders on South Africa's positions, giving in-depth analysis and information on key departmental issues, etc., etc. The whole point very much being focused on Ubuntu. And then we have the latest term on the UN Security Council, with President Ramaphosa at the helm. And do we have a new dawn, which is often associated with President Ramaphosa, or do we have a little more Madiba magic coming to the fore? That is South Africa using the iconic legend of Madiba to try and reinforce for the international community that South Africa was a moral state with a compass and would return to its focus on human rights and basically return to Ubuntu, understanding humanity. South Africa has, in this sense, a fairly unique approach to global issues. And as my colleague at UP, Chris Asike, and a colleague of his wrote, it's all about soft power. So South Africa has this platform of the diplomacy of Ubuntu as a soft power tool at its disposal. And this is all about lying in the ability and willingness to achieve the global good by seeking consensus with other nations through multilateralism. This is, I feel, a very progressive approach to foreign policy that fosters equitable and just development for all. The problem, of course, is that it also seems very idealistic. And in the world of the real world scenario of the UN Security Council, it may not always be the case that you're able to put people first or see humanity in a common way, especially when it's so heavily politicized. And how do you do that when you only have 2 years on the Security Council? South Africa is privileged because we've spent 3 terms on the Council in such a short period of time. And as a result, we've built up institutional memory, and that helps us. It is an advantage for us. But for other E10 members who only serve once in a blue moon, for example, there's very little that they may be able to achieve in that 2-year period. So South Africa really is benefiting from its term on the Security Council. The key thing I also wanted to focus on, though, is coherence and consistency. Because naturally, context will differ, and states sometimes have to make things up as they go along. We can all understand this because circumstances might change terribly. But it doesn't automatically imply that states will suddenly behave in a completely unrecognizable way if a situation does change. But what it does enforce is a more nuanced interpretation of multiple complex environments acting in parallel and what a state may do with these environments in a specific time and place. Sometimes sudden international changes, as I've said, can cause shocks for a country's foreign policy making. And predictability in international relations benefits from consistency in foreign policy, because constancy or consistency has its merits. It can engender stability, or at least in the UN Security Council, a knowingness. Alita said before, napness. Well, I'm talking about a knowingness about how a state will likely behave in a situation. And this can aid regional partners in the UN Security Council Africa 3, A3, for example, or the E10 elected 10 members in anticipating how to relate to each other during the duration of the term on the Council. Because it's so limited, this could save valuable time and effort. It's also very true to distinguish between foreign policies that are truly incoherent and those that are coherent but not adhered to consistently. And that's something South Africa really has been criticized for before, because since 1994, South Africa has a very coherent foreign policy. It's there for everybody to see in all of the strategic documents. It has not changed from day one. We progress and profess the same things on a daily basis. It's in our actions sometimes that we have caused confusion, and it seems to have been ambiguous. Why we take certain stances when we do, why we don't. And at the UN, states are expected to act consistently upon their own proposed resolutions, for example, which should be in line with their declared foreign policy on an issue. Unfortunately, the real-world circumstances of the Security Council reveal the inability of E10 members to hold the pen, as we've heard this morning, on resolutions in the first place, and secondly, the need for these members to adjust their positions on issues simply to ensure any resolution that might have some positive impact in conflict situations in order to try and ensure that it will be adopted. Previous theorists have indicated that in order to understand the potential influence of E10 members, which is such an important thing, as Angela was also referring to earlier today, you might be able to look at key points like legitimacy or diplomatic capacity or competency or favorability of conditions, formal and informal mechanisms of influence. You might also look at things like timing or political context, the membership at the time. Is there a partner that you can align with in the E10 that is in sync with your thinking on something? And also the important presence of high-level political dignitaries. All of these things could strengthen the positions of E10 members on the Security Council. What I'd like to suggest is that consistency in relation to declared foreign policy positions is another factor that can be considered and should be considered in how an E10 member's influence can be perceived by observers at the UN. If I have a chance very quickly now to reflect on South Africa's third term, for example, at the UN Security Council. We know that South Africa had, in its first 2 terms, not really been able to focus on harmonizing an A3 position necessarily on the Council, nor had it been witness initially to a coordinated E10 working approach or common agenda. However, E10 coordination evolved and closer relations developed, and by South Africa's second and third terms, there were to be E10 monthly meetings on Council issues, and South Africa saw an evolution of the organization of the E10 in terms of the political coordinators of elected states. In its third term, South Africa worked harder with other stakeholders in society, in civil society, to establish an African consensus, which paid off during the Republic's lead on the machinations around Resolution 2493. Informed consensus and dialogue became important for South Africa, which, together with Sweden, had led an initiative since late 2018 for E10 members to get together and to basically get up to speed on Council working methods. And South Africa saw this as a way to strengthen the role of the E10. Even after South Africa left the Council, it continued to actively host these monthly meetings in Pretoria and globally to engage E10 diplomats in following Council themes and debates. A key lesson from this third term, however, must be better communication established between New York and Addis Ababa when reflecting on UN Security Council and AU Peace and Security Council and coordinated missions and efforts. The A3 coordination realistically adjusts, obviously, according to the dynamic and combination of its membership. For example, when Tunisia was a UN Security Council member, there was no coordinated A3 response in Libya because of geopolitical regional undercurrents shaping and isolating the Tunisian position. Where better coordination is possible is through efforts to strengthen cooperation between the A3 and the AU PSC, as I said, in Addis Ababa, which Algeria has initiated in what Addis Ababa expects in order to avoid confusion, as clearly was the case between South Africa in 2018, in October 2019, in relation to its efforts to discuss Ethiopia's peacekeeping financing debate issue. In summary, the lesson for South Africa in terms of its UN Security Council experiences is that geopolitical differences threaten the effectiveness and credibility of the Security Council to carry out its mandate effectively. An example of this was evident in terms of the WPS agenda, which some colleagues have already referred to earlier today. And although South Africa was lauded by many for its successful adoption of Resolution 2493 on WPS, the Republic also ran into criticism by local observers for its October 2020 yes vote in favour of a Russian-sponsored draft resolution on the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325. And critics suggested that the draft resolution implied an erosion of women's rights advances at the UN. DIRCO felt compelled to respond to this criticism, explaining that South Africa had joined with E10 members Indonesia and Vietnam to vote for a resolution that reaffirmed the entire normative framework of the WPS agenda by urging the implementation of all previous WPS resolutions adopted by Council to date. So it was offering an explanation for its reason behind that vote. South Africa has acted consistently on its declared foreign policy at the UN Security Council in 2019 and 2020, when actually one dives deeply into each independent vote, especially on issues related to Africa, so situations in Africa that often emerge on the Security Council, that the South African position or approach is, in my perspective, a good multilateral diplomat will pay attention to details and to processes. And I think this comes up every time South Africa votes on a resolution. There is a popular African proverb that says that if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. And this proverb can explain the dynamics South Africa has encountered on the UN Security Council. The Republic has attempted to enable closer coordination among the A3 during its third term. And South Africa has always, in my view, made an effort at the UN using its resources. Lindiwe Sisulu originally had stated that South Africa wholeheartedly believes in the value of nations working together for a common destiny. And I think that's reflected in the diplomacy of Ubuntu once again. Coordinated teamwork is a must, and a determination to stay active and alert to the UN Security Council activities, even when not on the Council. It's unlikely that South Africa will serve again anytime soon on the Security Council, as it needs to make room for other Southern African states that will aspire to occupy a seat. But we have obviously just heard that South Africa is going to be serving back on the Human Rights Council anyway. Interpreting its own performance, DIRCO has indicated that South Africa believes it's perfected its systems and that its presence is palpable at the UN, that they may not have the power of the veto, but their voice is strong, and in their view, during the third term, their moral authority was back. Whilst on the UN Security Council, South Africa has a voice, a voting voice, and was prepared to use it. South Africa is establishing a pattern of behaviour in this arena between its declared foreign policy and its actions, and has been somewhat effective in this in its Security Council role. Assuming that South Africa's foreign policy remains unchanged, and depending on how soon the Republic will return to the Security Council, whether or not this effectiveness can be harnessed in its A3 and E10 working relationships in future remains to be seen. We've also noted how in its third term, South Africa's position on, for example, the Syrian situation and the number of open border points for humanitarian access, this was an example of how the country tried to break out of the perception that South Africa is always voting on the side of Russia and China. In other words, South Africa is very heavily focused on its P2 alignment. Although Russia only wanted one border crossing, the P3 at the time, the UK, the US and France wanted more. South Africa's view was a unifying and independent one, in a sense, to support any and all positions in order to ensure that either way at least some aid would be getting through. It should be noted, however, that South Africa's behaviour at the UN earlier this year, in 2022, even though it's not linked to the UN Security Council, over the resolutions pertaining to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that is, refusing to vote in a sense against Russia but choosing to remain neutral or abstain, does really raise questions in terms of international perceptions of the Republic's ability to act independently of Russian interests. It's very important that we also ascertain that South Africa has, for all of its terms on the Security Council, conveyed to the international community its refusal to be a bystander in the Security Council, It will not be window dressing in the Council, and it will not be a rubber stamper in the Council. That it is my sincere view that South Africa has tried through its 3 terms, through a maturity and a more nuanced approach, tried to establish for itself an independent role, or to carve out a role for itself in an independent way, where it tries not to be seen as a pawn or a puppet of either the P3 or the P2. And whether or not that means in the end South Africa comes across as a country that has Ubuntu at the heart of its foreign policy is obviously something that's up for debate and criticism, as has been the case most recently this year. I think that to end off, if I can, it obviously requires better articulation. If you put foreign policy decisions out there that are clear, transparent, coherent, and consistent, in other words, they reflect a direct alignment, the action, with the declared foreign policy statement, that this will ensure there is no trust deficit, which I believe could be happening more and more whenever there's ambiguity over South Africa's positions on the Council, especially in relation to human rights issues, that this trust deficit should be removed, that any misunderstandings should be removed through this transparency and through this coherent interpretation of our foreign policy. Otherwise, I am concerned that there will be a continuing problem in relation to trust and credibility, whether or not we're a normative broker or not. And this will come at the expense of a country's interests, our IR commitments, and our status. And I do think that South Africa has played a significant role in the Security Council, and if we get the chance to serve again, we should make sure that consistency is the backbone of our foreign policy behaviour. Thank you.
I must commend Prof for not asking for extension of time, but she rather donated 5 minutes of her time to us. So you should be getting your questions ready, your observations as well. But I will crave your indulgence that having done a very good diagnosis of what the contribution of South Africa has been at the UN since 1994, I would as well crave your indulgence to sit your swords and keep your questions to yourself, because most of the questions you have, and I'm sure a lot of you already have these questions on your mind, will be answered by my colleague here.
You have high aspirations.
So you will discover that I have high expectations that some of the issues raised already, he is already aiming at them to shoot them down. So instead of taking questions, we would listen to my Director General from the DIRCO to give us a presentation, and thereafter we would have a free flow, probably adding her 5 minutes that she donated to us so that we can have a good session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner, and good afternoon, colleagues and excellencies. Thank you to Professor Adebayo from the University of Pretoria and Angela Selstrom from the Nordic Africa Institute for the opportunity for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation to address you today. DIRCO has been part of this process that you have embarked on, and we fully support its objectives. Minister Pandor and Director General Dango were unable to be here due to prior commitments. Minister Pandor did, however, send a message of support to the organizers of this event, and she stated in a letter to the organizers when we received the invitation for this event that as members of the international community, UN member states should pursue collaboration opportunities with civil society organizations, members of the academia, and global multilateral organizations such as the UN to enhance our understanding of the existing and emerging threats to peace and security, and collectively identify sustainable solutions towards the achievement of peaceful, developed, and sustainable communities. I close quote. So just to assure you of our full support for this initiative, and we find that engagements of this nature assist us in one, understanding the global system of governance, but also to understand each other's positions and how we approach matters. Chairperson, today we have heard about the enormous challenges that the Security Council faces. A question that perhaps can be posed is that, and specifically being an elected member, do we really want to be a member of the Security Council? Is it worthwhile serving on the Security Council, taking into account the divisions among permanent members, the fact that permanent members do not, or elected members do not have the same prerogatives, etc. This is a question that South Africa faced when we decided for the first time ever in 2007 to serve on the Security Council. And the question we asked, would we be making a difference by serving on the Council, or would we be best serving the interest of international peace and security by continuing our efforts as we've been doing through continental initiatives, through bilateral initiatives specifically on the continent, but elsewhere as well. The Charter of the UN in Article 23, actually, and it's an often overlooked article in the Charter, it actually lays down criteria for membership of the Council as an elected member. It states basically there's two criteria. One, it's your ability to contribute. I'm paraphrasing, of course. It's your ability to contribute to international peace and security, and secondly, it looks at equitable geographical distribution. Unfortunately, it's the latter criteria that has become the predominant factor when deciding on who should serve in the Security Council. But we looked at the first part, and South Africa takes that very seriously. We looked at it and we felt that based on our track record, based on our contribution to international peace and security, we do meet the criteria in Article 23, and we would thus seek election. The country's values and a commitment to a better Africa and a better world that is not just part of a democratic South Africa's foreign policy since 1994, but also an aspiration that goes as far back to the Freedom Charter in 1955, when the Congress of the People maintained that South Africa shall strive to maintain world peace and settlement of all international disputes by negotiation, not war. And that, in a sense, is the DNA of our approach on international peace and security up till this day, including on the current conflict in Ukraine. Chairperson, at the end of 2020, South Africa completed its third term as an elected member of the Security Council. And my colleague, Professor Graham, has elaborated, and I actually agree with many of the aspects that she has raised. I think she has adequately and more than adequately, perhaps better than I would do, elaborated on our approach and the positions we've taken on the various issues and why we took certain positions. But essentially, throughout the terms that we serve in the Security Council, South Africa, and I would say that we did not surprise anyone in any manner, in that we were consistent in the approach that we followed in all three terms that we served. One of the theme of our term, in our last term, was continuing the legacy, working towards peace and security. And part of it was continuing the legacy and the values of Madiba, because we were elected in the year of the centenary of his birth. But it was also continuing the legacy of what we started. One of the advantages of being an elected member in quick succession, and unfortunately we can't do that all the time because of the geographical distribution and the sharing of the seat among members within our regions. But one of the clear advantages is an advantage that permanent members have by divine right, it seems, and that is the ability to be able to build on what you've started. Many elected members go into the council with well-meaning intentions. You start initiatives, but you're not able to see through those initiatives. 2 years is a very short time, especially if you haven't served, and some members go into the council either for the first time or having never served, either having never served before or having served decades before. And then to start an initiative or to get into the manner of work of the Security Council, to understand the working methods, etc., takes some time. And by the time you leave, you may not have achieved some of the initiatives that you began. And when you go back again, time may have passed or others may have moved on to other priorities. So one of the advantages we've had was being able to build on some of these initiatives. That includes specifically the key priority that permeated or was felt through all three our terms, and that is strengthening cooperation between the United Nations and regional organizations, specifically the African Union. But another aspect, and I think it has been spoken about earlier today by some of the speakers, has been how do we improve the working methods of the Council? We are permanent members of the General Assembly, and I think sometimes we forget that as we go into the Security Council, that we remain permanent members of the General Assembly. So how do we, as permanent members of the General Assembly, ensure that we build a council and maintain a council that is able to be transparent, it is able to be effective, and where we can continue to play some kind of role even when we're outside the council. In doing so, one of the aspects, again, it has been elaborated by previous speakers, including Professor Graham, quite effectively, what has been South Africa's initiatives in strengthening the engagement among the A3. There is always African representation on the Security Council. I think we sometimes forget that Africa is always represented in the Security Council, but Africa is not represented, like Latin America, we are not represented in the permanent category. And that, of course, has its own drawbacks because of the lack of institutional memory, the fact that you do not have the veto, etc. But Africa does always have 3 members on the council. And how do we ensure that those 3 members of the council are able to work effectively to advance the priorities and positions that are adopted by the African Union, specifically the Peace and Security Council, which is mandated to deal with peace and security matters on the continent, specifically because so many of the issues on the Council's agenda coincide with that on the PSC agenda. The other aspect that we pursued was to ensure that there's a strengthening of relations among the E10. The E10 relations, again, I think Sharmila spoke to this, Professor Graham spoke to this. This for us is an important element. How do we ensure that elected members are not just visitors in the council, not just bystanders to what is going on and dictated upon by the permanent members? And we've seen in the last few years very effective initiatives by many elected members, and our endeavor was to ensure that we increase the capacity of elected members, to ensure that elected members are able to go into the council better capacitated and better able to understand the work of the council, even when we disagree. The challenge with talking about the A3 and the E10 as groupings, of course, is that we've got to remember that we are all part of different geographical groups. We've all got our national positions. We are not elected onto the Security Council as a representative for Africa or as a representative of the developing world or the non-aligned movement or a non-permanent member. We are representing ourselves, but we are part of these groupings where we share common values and common interests. So how do we build these alliances and look for commonalities? And with the E10, of course, the most common aspect of our work, perhaps not so much on substantive issues, but where we can work together, is to improve the working methods, because these are challenges we all face. The role of the NAM has also been, and it's become perhaps a bit more topical now that we've left the Council in the context of global developments, but that is something that we often overlook. The non-aligned movement can often be regarded as a 6th permanent member in the Security Council, depending on how many NAM members are serving on the Security Council at a particular time. Because as you would know, those of you who are familiar with the manner in which the Charter operates and voting takes place in the Security Council, you need 9 votes to have a resolution adopted. So if the NAM was to have 7 members in the council, and it has happened in the past where the NAM has had at least 5 or 6 members and 1 or 2 observers, you've had situations where the NAM has been able to wield more than the 7 votes. That could prohibit a resolution from being adopted. So you don't necessarily have to have a veto. The challenge, of course, is whether you can have coherence among NAM members on particular matters. But it's able to, the focus for us was to ensure that within the NAM there is better coordination and ability to engage, to share positions. So looking back on the 2 years of South Africa's last term, and also broadly, if you look at the work of the Council, there are some issues where the Council has been effective. I think the reflection we've had this morning on the impact that Ukraine has had on the Council is quite important. I think we had a similar reflection in the 1990s when the divisiveness in the Council post-Iraq also had an impact on the work of the Council. And the question for us has been, does that particular division have an impact on specifically the decisions made on African conflicts or on other matters that the Council is dealing with. And I think Sharmila spoke to that quite effectively. There you see that there has been some impact, and I think we see this across the multilateral fora. In the last few months, we've seen this, whether it is at UNESCO or in other multilateral forums. Even when we went to Kigali for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, the divisions that are prevalent in the UN and globally on Ukraine has an impact on other multilateral forums. So how do we ensure that we get beyond this? So there are files where the Council is often paralyzed due to lack of unity. These divisions, unfortunately, have been perpetuated in the last few months. And what we've found, even during the time we were in the Council, which of course predates the current divisions, is that even on areas where they were previously regarded as non-controversial and less politicized, such as humanitarian assistance and the Women, Peace and Security agenda, these have also become politicized and they are increasing divisions. The divisions we found in the resolution that Professor Graham spoke about in October 2020 on women, peace and security, and I will say this because I've said it before publicly, there was absolutely nothing wrong with the resolution in terms of taking back the women, peace and security agenda backwards. And I'll challenge anyone to go through that resolution with me to question whether that actually was the case, which was put forward by many of our colleagues, specifically from the Western countries, that argued that the resolution put forward by Russia was going to take back, or going to take the WPS agenda back. It actually did not, because the first line reaffirmed and endorsed all previous resolutions, which actually would have taken it forward, because there were some resolutions that Russia, in fact, had disassociated itself from in the past. So actually, this was a missed opportunity, specifically by our Western partners, to actually advance the WPS agenda. On other matters like Palestine, it's clear that global tensions in the Middle East and elsewhere have exposed the weaknesses and limitations of the Council. We've heard from the ambassador of Western Sahara this morning, and the divisions and the inconsistency and the contradictions of the Security Council on a matter like Western Sahara is clear. And it again, I would reiterate what was said by one of the previous speakers. When permanent members are involved, whether it is Ukraine and the failure of the Council to act on Ukraine because a permanent member has utilized its right to veto, or the situation in Palestine, or the situation in Western Sahara where it's impossible to get a resolution that is fair and balanced from the Security Council because of the dynamics in the Council. Actually, there was a former special envoy, or personal envoy they are called, personal envoys of the Secretary General on Western Sahara, Peter van Walsum, compatriot of Ambassador Peters, who said that the Security Council will never compel one of the parties to the conflict, a specific party to the conflict, if that party to the conflict does not want to do something. And you all know who I'm talking about, and you know why the Council has taken those particular kinds of decisions. I think that was raised earlier by the ambassador of the SADR. But this is the contradictions we find in the Council, and these are some of the challenges we face in the Council. There are times that countries, and all countries are, well, most countries in the Council, and it's prevalent today as well, where they pay lip service to what has been mooted as a multilateral rules-based system based on international law. This is something we've heard several times, especially in the last few months. This aspiration, of course, is utilized by countries when it is convenient. A rules-based multilateral system based on international law becomes manipulated by countries when they see fit, and it is utilized when they want to use it to their advantage. But this is the nature of global relations, and it's not just specific to the workings of the Security Council. Some of the challenges, other challenges that the Council faces has been cuts in peacekeeping budgets, which of course have had specific challenges for the African continent. This is something we've had to navigate. How do we deal with that? Noting, of course, that UN peacekeeping does have certain challenges, but it is peacekeeping on the cheap. the UN peacekeeping budget is minuscule compared to the size of some of the budgets of national governments. But yet the expectation from UN peacekeepers, specifically on the continent, is quite large. A large number of issues on the Council's agenda related, of course, to African conflicts. An anomaly in the Council is that, and it's been raised by Professor Ade as well earlier, is that former colonial powers are often the lead countries on country-specific matters dealt with by the Council. And this is the question of the pen holdership. And, you know, the pen holdership thing is quite a complex matter. It's quite easy to say, and the pen holdership, for those that are not familiar with the terminology we utilize in the work of the Council or in the UN, is that basically it's the lead country in the Council, the country that takes a blank sheet of paper and puts the pen to paper and writes the first draft of a resolution. And of course, that is a very influential and powerful position to be in, because then negotiations takes place on the basis of what you've presented. And as has been said, it's often the permanent members, and specifically the P3, and most often than not, it's P2, the UK and France, that holds the pen on many resolutions. But it is extremely difficult, and as elected members, we've often spoken about taking the pen. But it's easier said than done. One, as we've spoken about, the institutional capacity that permanent members have is immense. And I think that is perhaps the advantage that even overshadows that of the veto. The veto is there, yes, it's a reality that permanent members have, but the institutional memory and capacity that permanent members have is perhaps their biggest advantage. And that makes it extremely difficult to draft a resolution on a particular matter when you have not been dealing with it or do not know the nuances of that particular matter and the negotiations that have taken place on that particular matter. So what has come up is sharing the pen, for example, but that as well, it's when you want to take on that responsibility, you've got to be an elected member that has the capacity so that you play an effective role and not just merely play a junior partner role. You know, one of the issues, and it's become now practice, where when the Security Council visits the African continent on its field visits, there is always an African member that is a co-chair, co-lead of that visit, or either leads that visit. That was not the case when South Africa went into the Security Council in 2007. And I'll quote our then ambassador, Ambassador Dumisani Khumalo, who was our permanent representative at the time. And when the issue was first raised, and we were told that the Security Council would be visiting, and South Africa was serving for the first time ever, so we faced with our first visit to the Council, and he asked a question: you are going to be visiting my home, my continent, and you are expecting me to be led by you when you are going to my home? And that's the question he asked. And South Africa was then became a co-lead of the visit. And since then, it's become practice that an African country either does that or leads. So the issues of pen holdership, I think, has to be tied with the issue of capacity and institutional memory as well. So it's not as easy as just saying, well, we'll take on that responsibility, because you do have that reality as well. Finally, Chair, and then I want to try and conclude, because I think the discussion is probably more useful than just me speaking, is that South Africa has striven to advance, and I touched on this briefly, the issue of AU-UN cooperation. This again has been spoken about earlier, but AU-UN cooperation is now taken for granted, that there is this cooperative framework between the two organizations, but it wasn't the case. It wasn't the case 20 years ago. Developments that took place in Burundi, developments that took place in Darfur, in Somalia, and subsequently in Libya, led us all to the conclusion that it is vitally important that regional organizations partner with the UN in addressing global conflicts that are taking place within their particular areas. And this has been a key aspect of our focus to ensure that the UN recognizes the role of sub-regional organizations and and the AU specifically in resolving conflicts on the continent. So, Chairperson, I want to come back to the question I posed earlier. Why would a country seek election to the Security Council? Is this, and I think this is something that we need to think about, is it the only place where you can make a contribution to the work of the UN? And in the context of what's been going on with Ukraine, is it also the only place you can make a difference on international peace and security? Because we know the challenges that the Security Council has faced, and the General Assembly has become much more effective in dealing with some of these issues, or has become the forum for engagement because of the challenges within the Council. So I want to reiterate that South Africa is committed to the multilateral system of governance as a basis to address global challenges, whether they be issues like peace and security, development, climate change, countering terrorism, or addressing the threat of nuclear weapons. Some of these issues are dealt with by the Security Council, but not all of them are dealt with by the Security Council. And most of them, or many of them, are dealt with by other parts of the UN, including its most representative body, the General Assembly. So therefore, we need to be committed to strengthening all parts of the multilateral system, especially the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, which is tasked with a very crucial responsibility, which is tied, no doubt, to peace and security, and that is the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs, adopted in 2015, faces key challenges in implementation. COVID, of course, but also the impacts of conflicts like Ukraine that has had a devastating impact on the means of implementing the goals contained in the SDGs. So the Security Council, as the mandated organ of the UN to deal with peace and security, remains important because of the power it wields, the responsibility it has in maintaining peace and security. South Africa has chosen to be part of it, and we have been, and as I conclude, I'd like to conclude by saying that we have felt that we've been able to make a contribution in a small manner, as an elected manner, but an effective manner. And as an elected member, that is all you can hope to achieve. You can't, in the absence of meaningful reform, which needs to take place, it's very difficult to change the way the Council works in its totality. But there are small differences you can make that can make the Council more effective, not just in its working methods, but also on substantive issues, whether it is ensuring that there is humanitarian access, or whether you're able to ensure that the Council does give particular focus to specific matters. One last thing that just came to mind now is that elected members have often been the drivers of many of the thematic issues that are on the Council's agenda. And the question arises, and it has crossed our minds as well as we deal with the issues on the Council's agenda. How important are these thematic issues? When we deal with civilians in armed conflict, youth peace and security, women peace and security, are these issues important, or are they a sideline of the Council's work, and actually the key part of the Council's work are the country-specific agenda items that it deals with? And I'd like to end off with saying that these are vitally important contributions of elected members. Whether it is the WPS agenda that was initiated by Namibia when 1325 was adopted, or other resolutions that have been piloted by elected members, the essential substantive output that have emanated from these thematic discussions, as long as we ensure that these aspects of work translates into meaningful changes on the substantive agenda items that we deal with, then these are useful discussions we need to have in the Council, and elected members can and have played a key role on that. I'll stop there, Chair, and we'll then take questions on this. Thanks.
May I crave your indulgence to give him one more round of applause for good presentation. Now, we're going into the main issues, because as far as this discussion is concerned, it is the salient points that matter. We have had, in practical terms, it's like a synopsis of South Africa's contribution to the UN since 1994. We've also, Professor Graham has highlighted some of the issues or challenges that the public faces in understanding the direction of foreign policy. Maybe that gives apt to the information in public domain that foreign policy is for the elites who just sit down, discuss over a cup of coffee or champagne, and we don't get a feedback. So it is out on the streets that diplomats don't do anything except to sit down and gossip. So Yes, so while they drink tea and coffee and share and clean glasses of champagne at the end. So we want to look at it more as professionals and as students in the academia. Let's take a few questions and see where we need to dot the I's or cross the T's. Then my two able speakers are by my side and waiting anxiously to answer to whatever question you may throw at them. So let's set the ball rolling. Good. Good.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Gjermund Sæther. I'm the ambassador of Norway to South Africa. And Norway is a member of the Security Council. Our term ends in end of December. So again, thank you very much to the organizers and to the presenters. I haven't been able to be here the whole day, but we have had some very good input, I've been told. I think I will, actually it's more comments than questions, and if I go on too long, please stop me. So again, thank you very much to the presenters. I think on E10, the way we see it after our 20 months in the Security Council now, first point, and I think, you know, some have alluded to it already, workload, very big. Twice as big as when we were in the Council last time, that's 20 years ago. Enormous preparations are essential. There are more structure and format to the E10 cooperation. I mean, there are, for example, lunches with the Secretary General, very useful, very useful. You know, when it comes to preparations, I think many countries have been building on each other and taking new initiatives, and South Africa is one of those who have taken initiatives. We also, when we entered the Council, we also had consultations with South Africa, both at foreign minister level and at officials level. Very, very useful. In a way, it becomes a bit of a relay in that sense. I think also Norway and Switzerland, we fund an AU workshop to prepare a tree that has been elected. Of course, for bigger African countries, that's not necessary, but I think for smaller countries, it's quite useful. And this is a AU-run workshop, and Commissioner for Peace and Politics, I mean, previously Shergi, now Bankola also attend. So it's also a way to build more coherent African positions among the different capitals, New York and Addis Ababa. I also think, as has been mentioned, that the E10 can achieve things when we are united. I think, again, this summer there were very difficult discussions on cross-cutting humanitarian aid into Syria. That was mentioned as an example, and the relations between P5 is really bad, and I think for the E10 actually played an important role in securing a 12-month extension of that humanitarian access that's so crucial for people inside Syria. And I think sometimes, of course, E10, there are disagreements. And I think on climate security development, there's a lot of agreement among many countries. And I think for Western countries and African countries in the Council now, there is full agreement. But there are some other E10, and there are a few P5 who don't agree. So that's, of course, a disappointment. But we should also remember that within the E10 group, there can be quite substantial policy differences. I think, you know, coming back to a question that was raised earlier today, obviously very important for the African continent and the Security Council, the issue of reform of the UN Security Council. And I think, as was mentioned earlier today, there is a bit of a new dynamic. France has also said that they are ready for text-based negotiations, which is quite a big step forward, I think. And there is a common Nordic position that we support permanent representation of Africa in the Security Council. So, and I think this is important not because it's morally right, but it's also important because if there is more African representation and permanent representation, the ownership to the institution will also be bigger. So then, you know, I was just thinking about Sahir's question, why do countries seek a seat at the UN Security Council? And I also agree very much with Sahir. There's a lot of things you can do outside the Security Council, and Norway is very active on many fronts. But for us, the basics of being in the Security Council is take upon the responsibility to try to promote peace in the world. And for us, you know, going back to the UN Charter 1945, why was it so important for us? It was very important for us because we were completely surprised when Germany invaded Norway in 1940. And why is this so important today? Well, because for us, Russia is doing exactly the same now. They behave like Nazi Germany. And then, of course, Norway and Germany are the best of partners today. So things can change. But I think we have to remember that is why the UN is so important for us. And I think also, if we look at the Uniting for Peace instrument that was mentioned earlier today, I think we are quite positive that more than 140 countries have voted to criticize Russia's aggression on 2 occasions. And we also see there are very few countries voting with Russia. But this blatant violation of the UN Charter is something that is very important for us. So, of course, we enter the Security Council because we want to avoid those type of things. But they happen anyhow, because there is a P5 doing that, because they adhere to the principle of might is right. So then going to the GA was a very good move, an important move for us, because this is about the basic rules. And I think we can certainly discuss if there has been uneven use of principles and the Charter is not always adhered to. I think that we should have that discussion. But first, I think we should, for us at least, 2 wrong doesn't make 1 right. And secondly, we can certainly discuss the issues. And I think just throw out 1 example, that's the Mauritius and the Chagos Islands. Chagos Islands, both from a judicial point of view and a United Nations General Assembly resolution, should be part of Mauritius, and we agree. But note also that Mauritius voted with us on the Ukraine resolutions both times. But we are happy to discuss different conflicts and what is, it's not always that the Charter is applied equally. We agree on that. So, if we look at the Security Council during this period of very tense situation due to Russia's invasion.
You have just 1 more minute.
Ah, it's too long? Yeah. No, I think it's, you know, it has also been commented before, but I think even with all difficulties, there has been able to have a text on issues like Afghanistan, Haiti, and Syria. But we see a spillover, and that is, of course, a concern. But we also feel that sometimes we are very cognizant of the fact that the Security Council should not always only talk about Ukraine. But the problem is also that Russia have asked for completely meaningless debates about biological weapons that doesn't exist in Ukraine. So, but okay, I take your clue. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Being the first speaker, he has enjoyed the privilege of taking up to 5 minutes. But I will now stick to 3 minutes for any intervention or question. 3 minutes, please.
Oh. Hello, hi. Thanks everyone for the presentations. My name is Thomas White, and I work with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I have 2 questions relating to Security Council reform. The first one concerns the elephant in the room, which is not China, but the veto. In the morning's presentations, we heard that one of the great successes of the Security Council is that it's been able to avert conflict between the great powers. And one of the reasons for this is the Security Council veto, so that to ensure that whenever one of the P5 strategic interests are affected, the Council is paralyzed, it's not able to act, and this is one of the ways through which we've been able to avert great 20th century scale armed conflict. So I want to ask, when we talk about Security Council reform, what do we have in mind for the veto? If Africa is to join the Security Council as a permanent member under any arrangement, will it join with the veto? Should it join with the veto? Or should the veto be abolished for all members, old and new? My second question then concerns the identity of this potential African Permanent Five member. I'm sure that the ambassador has a position on this, but I'd like to know what the other speakers think. Who should be the occupant of the African Union's chair? Should it be a common African Union position, or should we maintain this kind of distribution where you have some states in the region occupying permanent membership, or as opposed to just having one unified seat for the whole of Africa, or even two seats for that matter? Thank you.
Let's take one more question, then.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm
Victoria,
Shahana Rasool from the University of Johannesburg. Thank you for those very interesting presentations. I would like to sort of add on to the questions around reform. Do you think there's any way, or has South Africa has any impact in infusing Ubuntu into the Security Council and other bodies, besides just claiming to be driving an Ubuntu agenda? And sort of what would be a more critical analysis of our role in terms of Ubuntu? Thanks.
Made an observation and an addendum to the lectures we had. So let me say it's not a question per se. So we have one more question so that to make it three, then we go into discussion.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Excellencies and colleagues. My name is Khaurelo Magashwa. I'm from DIRCO. I am asking this question at the risk of sounding defensive because I am a DIRCO official. But I wanted to pick up on what Professor Graham was saying in terms of South Africa's voting patterns in the Security Council. And you gave an example of the voting when it came to the Syria file. And of course, there are many others where instances where South Africa is labeled as a puppet, and I think you mentioned this in your presentation, which was very excellent, by the way. Thank you very much for that. What we have observed is that when is South Africa voting and the vote happens to be the same as that of the P2, as they call them, the perception is that we are a puppet. And it appears that we are not allowed to have our own thinking, our own decisions, just because the vote happens to be the same as that of Russia and China. And I wanted to find out from you, and when we make an observation ourselves, we make an assessment, we see that when it comes to our peers, for example, BRICS countries, when India vote the same way as us, they don't get the heavy criticism that we get as South Africa. Brazil, the same as well. In your assessment, why is that? Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to try and address some or all of the questions. I think in relation to UN reform, it seems impossible to me now to ever have a scenario with the Security Council without a veto within it. And I think that's really for me because of the main reason behind creating the veto in the first place was to ensure that even though there was this neoliberal institutional organization created after World War II, there would still be an element of realism at the heart of it. In other words, there'd still be some gatekeeping tactic where great powers could still have their get out of jail free card if they didn't want something to happen. So it seems to me that it would be unlikely that that would ever disappear. it would take as long as it takes to reform the Council for the veto to change or disappear, in my view. Also, it seems odd to me if Africa doesn't have a common or unified position, for example, even on UN reform, as we've seen in the past, then what would happen if, South Africa, for example, was supposed to represent Africa on a permanent seat. And South Africa has been put forward as a state that would very easily take up that position because South Africa has 3 times tried to advocate Africa's interests on the Council when it's been sitting on the Council. And so wouldn't it slip in rather easily? And I know Prof. Ad is going to say absolutely not. And my panel member here, because Nigeria is also another equally perfect contender for the role. And then let's not, there are other contenders too on the continent. But I think the point is that at the end of the day, whether or not it's South Africa or Nigeria or Egypt or Kenya or whoever it might be in a potential permanent seat, would they be able to represent a common African voice on the Council if there's no common voice of 54 states today in other areas? It seems strange to me that would be something that would be expected. And then in terms of, okay, I think I've combined 2 of your questions there already in my answer. Then as Shahana was saying, the philosophy of Ubuntu is very attractive to states because it's very idealistic, and a common humanity really is at the heart of what the UN is. The UN was created to try and stop conflict by bringing peoples together in common understanding. And so Ubuntu really reflects that. So South Africa should be able to utilize the guiding philosophy of Ubuntu in its foreign policy. And it does in its principles on a daily basis. The problem is in its actions. And so rhetoric and actions have to align all the time. And South Africa is still considered to be a moral authority on the continent, despite what might be seen as faux pas along the way, because no state is perfect. And so South Africa is still a fairly young democracy compared to some others in the world today. And so it has this moral authority, and I think it's still considered to be a leader of the continent, whether or not that's self-imposed leadership or that is imposed upon South Africa by others on the continent, or whether or not some countries might consider it to be a hegemonic status, or, if we can still refer to that as a system. But the fact is that South Africa has this leadership role to play, and it should really be reflecting a foreign policy that is guided by Ubuntu, which it states in public declarations at all times. And so when it missteps or misaligns in any way, obviously that's going to be jumped upon as something that's hypocritical or in contradiction to their stated principles. So I think that it's a difficult thing to try and suggest that South Africa will continuously be able to follow this type of principle because it's an idealistic one. It's assuming that that there is a common humanity. It's assuming, that your humanity is the same as my humanity. And we know on a daily basis that your rights stop where my rights begin, kind of thing. So it's a difficult question. But I don't think that means South Africa should get rid of Ubuntu as a philosophy in guiding its foreign policy. I just think it's something it needs to work out for itself along the way, which it's attempting to do. And I'll finish off with your question here at the back here, my colleague from DIRCO, and saying that, again, it very much reflects on South Africa's position. So South Africa is almost picked on by the international community whenever it votes seemingly in line with Russia or China. But it might simply be that South Africa has its own point of view, and this is what it wants to do, and this is what it wants to say. And I've looked at many, many, many different votes of South Africa since '94 throughout the UN General Assembly till now. I've looked at thousands and thousands and thousands of votes. And I can say in all my research that South Africa is actually, for the most part, 85% consistent in all of its voting. But that those areas where it's picked on, and when I say picked on, is in obviously human rights promotion, because that's a principle of our foreign policy that we declare on a daily basis, and whether or not we vote on human rights promotion or say that it should be voted on in a different platform, or say that for technical reasons it shouldn't be in the Security Council, etc., brings up the suggestion that we are prioritizing our foreign policy principles based on context and the timing of a certain point of view that we have. So I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well to you, but what I'm trying to suggest is that we have specific foreign policy principles, and we try to act on those. Sometimes it's out of sync with a Western point of view, sometimes it's out of sync with an Eastern point of view. But as I said in my presentation, I honestly do think that South Africa is trying to carve an independent role for itself in the UN Security Council when it is on it. And that's something I think we should try and continue to do, even if it is a disappointment to some people around the world. Thank you.
Zaid,
Thanks,
you
Chair.
have something to add?
I will be very brief. I think
Okay.
just to answer the question, a direct question to the colleague that asked about, from the UN, that asked about the African position with regard to the veto and who would represent South Africa, or who would represent South Africa, who would represent Africa in the permanent category. The Common African Position, which was adopted in Ezulwini, is very clear, and it answers both your questions. The first part, it says, and I'll quote, it says, even though Africa is opposed in principle to the veto, it is of the view that so long as it exists and as a matter of common justice, it should be made available to all permanent members of the Security Council. And this perhaps is the key deviation between the Ezulwini consensus or the Common African Position and that of again, Ambassador, I don't want to quote your position, but the G4 position, where there's a slight divergence on the way the veto is looked at, but other aspects of our position is almost very similar or identical. The other part of who would be representing Africa, again, Ezulwini is very clear. It says, the African Union should be responsible for the selection of Africa's representatives in the Security Council, and the question of the criteria for the selection of African members of the Security Council should be a matter for the AU to determine, taking into consideration the representative nature and capacity of those chosen. So again, there's criteria that has been laid out in Ezulwini, but Ezulwini makes it very clear. So just to answer that. I think I'll stop there. I think the other aspects, perhaps Professor Gramsci has covered that more effectively. The issue of perception of South Africa's voting patterns vis-a-vis that of being close to a particular part or particular side within the Security Council is something we've tried to dispel. And again, I think your indication, Professor Graham, of an analysis of the resolutions that we voted across the board would dispel that notion. I've said this before and I'll say it again. When we did consider our voting, or when we do consider our voting even today on a particular matter, it's not, the considerations are based on South Africa's values, South Africa's own laws, South Africa's own constitution. The considerations are not what this capital or that capital thinks about that matter. Of course, that is part of the analysis, but that is not the consideration we take into account in deciding how we should vote. And therefore, you will find, and you have found in the Security Council, that South Africa has voted with particular permanent members on particular matters, and it has voted with other permanent members. And it goes across the UN system. There was a vote in the IAEA board a few months ago on the matter of Iran, and that matter was perhaps and nobody, I wonder why, nobody accused us of being a puppet of Washington because we voted in a particular matter, in a particular manner that was different to that of Moscow. But that is the nature of international relations. Ultimately, we will apply our positions based on the merits of the matter before us. And that's why an issue, and I don't want to go back to what I said earlier, but a matter like the WPS resolution of October 2020 is troublesome to us and worrisome, is that countries unfortunately look at who has tabled a particular matter rather than looking at the substance of a matter. And that's what we should look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Zahir. You have spoken the minds of most of us who represent governments across the continent. What I would love to add, which probably has been downplayed, is the position of the AU. Most often, before we go into the vote, no matter the interval, we do consult, and as much as possible, most of the countries vote in consonance with the position of the AU. This is deliberate to strengthen the regional bloc as an emphatic representation of the geographical spread of our people on the continent. So now I would seize the opportunity to take those who are on the digital platform. Do we have some of those?
No, we don't.
Pardon?
We don't have any questions online.
Oh, we don't have any question on the, okay. So let's, maybe we take a few more questions and then we do the closing remarks. Any question, or we're Okay. Come up with your question, please.
No, thank you very much. I didn't think that I might want to speak again. But I think there's a point that we are missing, which particularly I'm speaking to the South African audience and South African observers of what happens. And the very fact that we look at our foreign policy and we say everything about it is good. It has been consistent, it has never changed. But I think it is important to understand that however good your foreign policy might be, the environment in which you implement it, you are not in control of. And particularly within the United Nations, we are not in control. As it has been indicated, if you have to engage a draft that has been presented by a pen holder who's got different views and values, and you want to find consensus, it means we've got to negotiate that text to a point where at least there's a win-win solution that comes out of it. And it will be either weak or strong to the observer. But what is important is the explanation of vote, which our media sometimes also does not pick up, because that's where the principal positions of our constitution, our national interest, comes into play and explain why in the complex situation or problem that is being addressed, we voted in the manner in which we did. So that people can understand that we don't betray our principles and values in the process of doing so. But we are trying to find a consensus so that there must be an outcome that takes the process forward, rather than being an obstacle in that situation. And I think it's a very important issue.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
A brief question. We can pick it up in the last session. But the one debate that I really was expecting here, a lot of our European ambassadors and diplomats are very disappointed with South Africa's active non-alignment policy to the Ukraine crisis. And I think it would be a bit of a failing if we didn't have more of a debate. So I'm hoping that the Germans and Swedes will pick this up and that the South Africans will also defend themselves. And I'm saying this as a good Nigerian.
Are you taking that, Prof? Because I want to save my brother here, because he will be able to hide under the cover of academics. So Dr. Graham will have the academic cover on that issue, so that the policy issue which Zahar can comfortably hide under. I think, so I will pass it to Dr. Graham.
I wanted to quickly respond to my colleague here, and then I'll respond to Prof. Ade, and say to any interested parties and media watching that it's very easy to find the explanation of votes for every single resolution through the UN Digital Library. They're all listed there very happily and comfortably. And then Prof. Ade, yes, I know this is a very difficult one, and you know, I should say that we should push this to the next session because I won't be presenting then. But I have a specific point of view on this, because to be honest with you, I was really thrilled when Dr. Pandor initially announced what she announced after the immediate response to the Ukraine invasion. And I thought, oh, that's so great. I'm so proud of South Africa for saying that. And then when it came to voting on positions and we became, you know, neutral on the position, I actually understood from the background of how I've researched South Africa over the years why we took that position. And it wasn't the first time we've abstained on a Ukraine resolution either at the UN. So we were actually consistent with our previous policies on Ukraine at the UN. It was just such a shocking thing to happen internationally that I was relieved and delighted to hear Dr. Pandor's statements. But I have to say that I understood why South Africa abstained in the end. So that's a diplomatic route if anybody's looking for a diplomat and no longer an academic, then I'm available. That's it, Prof. That's my point of view.
Ambassador, you have any?
Not an ambassador, but I'll take it.
No,
I'll take the question, not take the title. No, I see none of our colleagues from the...
Yeah.
Professor has thrown his line out, and am I the only one taking the bait? I'm looking at my colleagues from the European countries, but I'll take it. I'll take the bait. Firstly, I just want to say that an abstention is not neutrality. I think Minister Panda has made that very clear. It's a position. It's a position that is taken. Those of you that have been in the UN or in other multilateral meetings know that there are 3 buttons in front of you. There's a red button, a green button, and an orange button, an amber button. There's a 4th option, which is not voting at all for whatever reason. But we see am I saved?
You go ahead, your mic.
My mic is on. That gave it away. I couldn't use that as an excuse. So just to indicate that it is a position. We have a position on the situation in Ukraine. South Africa has made it very clear what our position is. An abstention, and it's not just South Africa, a large number of countries. And yes, Ambassador of Norway did indicate that roughly 140 countries in the 4 resolutions that have been put forward, it's about that number that have voted in favor of the resolutions that were tabled, in the 4 resolutions that have been tabled thus far, since February 24, under the agenda item, under the emergency session agenda item. The countries and a significant number of the non-aligned movement and members that have abstained have maintained the view that yes, we have a position. We do, as for example, on the last resolution that was adopted recently on the referenda and the annexation, South Africa reaffirms quite categorically the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. South Africa does indicate its own perspectives pertaining to the matter. And an abstention in that way is, yes, we agree with aspects of the resolution, but we don't agree with all aspects of the resolution. And I think that needs to be clear, that it is not a neutral position. We have not chosen to be neutral. There is room, we think, for countries like ourselves, and there should be room in a democratic, rules-based international system based on international law for countries to adopt that kind of position, a position of non-alignment. There was room for countries to be non-aligned during the Cold War, and as the world moves in this kind of situation where you are seen to be on one side or the other, and I can tell you as a diplomat working on the matter, we receive démarches. South Africa doesn't démarche anyone, by the way. We receive démarches from our friends, and we receive requests for consultation from other friends. And you can take from what I just said who says what. And we also get feedback from both sides, and both sides are not completely happy with what we do. But we've got our position, and we will continue to apply our minds to the matters that come before us and take those positions. But I just want to stress that that is not staying out of the matter or being neutral.
Okay, you have the floor.
Thank you so much.
It's Mike is on. I chaired the Foreign Policy Committee in Swedish Parliament during my time as a politician, during the time when Sweden was a non-aligned country. And it was described that we are not member of any military alliance, Warsaw Pact or NATO. But when we use the word non-alignment today in that remark, what kind of non-alignment are we talking about?
Yes, Your Excellency, the use of the word non-aligned is in English term to show that you are not taking sides. Just in the language term, the language terminology of non-aligned simply means you are staying in the middle. You are not faulting anybody. You're not passing judgment. You are not putting anybody before a judicial committee or so.
No, sir, sir, I'm very well aware of that. And Sweden was a prominent member of the non-alignment movement. That was a movement. But what kind of non-alignment are we talking about? Is it a movement? Is it a group of countries? Do they meet? Do they have meetings? Is it a board? What kind of non-alignment are we referring to?
The speaker used the term strictly in language form, not in terms of movement. The non-aligned movement is moribund, and it has stayed so for a long time. I'm not sure that South Africa has convened any meeting now or in the distant past for non-aligned movement to come to the table for any, but the consultations are open at the UN at all times.
So just final remarks. So non-alignment today is not a political statement. So non-alignment is not a united movement in some extent. It's more a word, because I refer to non-alignment during my time in Parliament when Sweden was part of the non-alignment movement together with other countries. So I'm just still referring to more than the word. What is non-alignment today? What is it worth? What is the meaning of that?
No, I think we can get into that kind of discussion as to what non-aligned means. I thought I explained it quite clearly to the, but it's clear. For us, it is an approach that we've, but it is also not. I just want to say that it is taking a position. That is what I want to stress. That we have taken positions. It may not be a position that is completely aligned to one side or the other. And we find that that is very dangerous in the current context. And it's not just Ukraine. It goes back now for several years, including the time we served on the Council. As I said, countries were willing to sacrifice the advancement of the WPS agenda because a particular country, and it's both sides, the other side does the same. When a particular country tables something, because it is coming from the other side, it is not accepted, because there is this perception that nothing good can come from that side. That is the problem with global relations if we maintain that kind of approach. But the approach of looking at issues on its merits is something I think we need to seriously consider. But it's a dialogue we can continue, Ambassador, and I think it's a healthy dialogue. We need to learn from each other and to understand where we come from as well. Thank you.
I hope I'm not offending you, because I saw your hand came up. Okay, thank you very much. Your Excellencies, distinguished and eminent scholars in this gathering, please join me in appreciating our speakers who have eloquently delivered on their mandate to keep us informed, to keep us also abreast and improving our appetites for global conversations. So conversation on global issues, one good thing about that is that they are dynamic. The world is never static. So if you are not discussing economy, you are discussing politics. If you are not discussing politics, you are discussing some disasters due to climatic change, or some disasters that are man-made, such as some bombs dropping somewhere. So we are also in the mix when it comes to even issues of environmental concern, that in those past days we used to have something like dumping. And then now we have crisis that involve peacekeeping. And like we have said earlier today, that 80 to 85% of the UN interjection or interference or crisis management comes from Africa and is domiciled in Africa. We have all this changing scenario on daily basis. So discussions on global issues are ever changing. And my good friend here, Zaha, has aptly said the discussion continues. So on this note, may I thank Professor Graham and Zaha for having kept us informed and abreast of global issues and have stimulated our appetite for further discussions. I thank you for your audience. Coffee outside. Okay.